Let me begin by introducing the next panel, or the moderator for the next panel. It's Nick Delana. Nick Delana is another great friend, a member of the board of NDIA New England. He, Ryan Hydorn, and I were responsible for initiating this wonderful event some 7 months ago, and we've been joined by many others of our board and associates of our board to put this on, and it's been a great experience for all of us. So Nick, I was complaining because there's so many, he can explain himself. But Nick, so I'm going to read this. He's a partner at the Business Advisory Group at DGC. That's the thing you have to remember, right, Nick? DGC, which is a division of PKF O'Connor Davies, a regional accounting firm here in New England, a great firm. So Nick heads DGC's IT risk assurance and advisory practice, and they are on the glide path for being a C3PAO. You are not yet, is that correct?
Or candidate.
Candidate,
Yep.
Okay. So there's some frontline experience for you right there. So Nick, if you come to the stage and then introduce your panelists. Thank you.
I will. And I will vamp a bit as we get mic'd up. All right, great.
And I will go in search of Ryan Bonner.
We have him.
Oh, you have him?
Yes.
Great. He's been found.
So I'll tell some jokes until we're ready to get started here.
Okay, all right.
So I appreciate the introduction, Dan. We did go through a rebranding. We merged recently. So my practice is now the Cyber and Privacy Advisory Practice at DGC, a division of PKF O'Connor Davies. As Dan mentioned, we are a candidate C3PAO. We're also an RPO as well. So we're doing quite a bit of work right now helping companies get ready for CMMC. I'm privileged to be joined by a panel of preeminent experts, including Ryan, in civil and criminal law, contracts, cyber compliance, and supply chain. I'll let everybody introduce themselves. We'll start with Ryan.
Sure. So my name is Ryan Bonner, fashionably late. I apologize for that. I am over at DefCert. We're a compliance consulting firm, mostly working with SMBs in the defense contracting base, and doing a lot of work with NIST MEP programs, state economic development groups, just getting our reps in with a lot of small businesses over the last few years.
Great. Alex?
My name is Alex Major. I'm the co-leader of the Government Contracts and Global Trade Group at McCarter & English. I'm a partner with Dan. Been doing this for a long time. That's the gray hair and the beard, and that's why I shaved the head. I'm a retired Air Force intelligence officer, so this, I always like to say I wasn't raised a lawyer. It's a second career for me. So, but happy to be here and happy to talk about this subject, as I do a lot.
David Petrie, RMD, Supply Chain Risk and Cybersecurity. RMD stands for Raytheon Missiles and Defense. So for the earlier conversations, I'm one of the prime, apparently stuck in the middle. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. It's good to be here.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Sigmund. Up until 4 weeks ago, I was the National Security Chief for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. I've been working in national security for more than 20 years. I started my career as a lawyer as a Navy JAG. I was stationed down in Norfolk, Virginia. And now, I joined a law firm, Hinckley Allen, one of the silver sponsors, and I am heading up their international trade and global security practice, also working in cybersecurity. And since I was in charge of all the national security investigations and prosecutions here in Massachusetts, I could probably speak about any of the areas that espionage, terrorism, export control, and sanctions, if anyone has a question about that.
I suspect there might be a few. So originally, we were going to start by talking about really just catching the audience up on where CMMC is at right now. We're privileged to have Stacy come a little earlier in the day, so I think we've got that out of the room. But since the topic of the panel is the cost of noncompliance, I'd like to just poll the panel on where they think the state of compliance is today. Open question. We'll start with Ryan.
I think we're starting to see different parties learn a little bit more about each other as the months progress, as we head towards potential rulemaking at the end of the year. The DoD is starting to ask more specific questions about the defense industrial base and they're learning things through these DCMA audits and things like that, that, you know, the large majority of the contracting base isn't where they need to be from a compliance perspective. And they've been receiving language in contracts and solicitations that have, you know, made some inferences about where they should be, and there's a gap there. And I think that the defense industrial base is starting to learn about their, you know, their DoD counterparts, sort of, you know, learning that we're going to start exploring this idea of 180-day POAM windows, and we're going to talk about things like no 5-point requirements left unimplemented. And that looks like a much more measurable way to move away from self-attestation into something more documented. And so as sort of these two parties move closer and closer to an understanding, the question then becomes, where does the accountability for those gaps start to mount, and what happens when, you know, the gap's too big and Evel Knievel can't make the jump?
I think it's exactly where it was in 2017, which is exactly where it was in 2016, which is exactly where.
With the optimist.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and the general spoke about it as well. You know, I think we're getting mired in definitions, or we wish to be mired in definitions. This is coming from a lawyer, that we wish to be mired in definitions, and not realizing that, you know, the rules are there. They've been there since when? Anybody know? 2012. Yeah, actually 2010, 2011, you start seeing the genesis, right? So, I mean, honestly, and we hear it in the DoD a lot, you can actually hear the eye rolls. But I really do think that, you know, we get trapped in this definitional morass, and so I think that's that's where we're at right now. And now we're like, okay, and I think CMMC, for its good and bads, and if you've read what I've written, you know where I stand on that. But in terms of, it at least started people going, like leaning forward going, oh, for reals? Like people were starting to think this is something that's actually going to take place. And I think with CMMC, and I wanted to ask the question, does anybody know what the first M stands for now? No? Okay. But now that that's sort of been taken off the burner, right? It's on the cravat. Then it's going to be very curious to see exactly what happens. But I just don't think there's been movement because, you know, people say finger pointing. I don't think it's finger pointing. I think it's, well, what if we pick on this scab over here? Let's talk about this port. Nothing gets done. So that's my thought.
So it's an excellent question. I think that earlier there was some conversation from Jacob about percentages on who's compliant and who's not, and I kind of tend to agree with that.
I was going to say, you have some perspective.
The extent of what we do in terms of kind of vetting suppliers is we ask the question, are you compliant to 7012? And they say yes. Okay, well, that's fine. But, you know, it's the way it's written right now, it's self-attestation. So, you know, the problem is, okay, 6 months after I see that, you know, yes, I get an email in the morning, it says cyber incident. And you read through the details and it's like, okay, well, they weren't. You know, so it's concerning. I mean, similar to Alex has lost his hair, my hair's gone gray. So, you know, I worry every morning about getting up and reading another email. So it's the assessment is a really important part, you know, to get that going and get that done so that at least we know where we stand.
So from the, I will speak from the DOJ side because that's where I just came from, and also now helping companies. And what I will say this is that the cybersecurity, the breaches, you know, that when the breach occurs, the company that has the breach is going to suffer unbelievable damage, right? And they're going to have to report it if they're a sub to the prime, and et cetera. And that's where I saw it. And I saw that, you know, we would get involved when there's a breach at the U.S. Attorney's Office and trying to figure out how bad is it. Did the foreign government get our stuff? And so from that perspective, and I think that's where the government now, and I'll be speaking in a few minutes about the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, is going to be looking at. Is like, was there a breach? Did you report it? Were you monitoring your system? Is there things you could have done to prevent it? And so from a perspective of cybersecurity, that's where I think the compliance should be focused and making sure that you are not, I mean, to the extent you can, I mean, as there's announcements every day about everyone is going to be subject to a breach. And the question is, well, is it a breach or just a cybersecurity incident where there was no exfiltration of data? So that's where I think the government is going, is they're looking for more reporting on the cybersecurity angle. I mean, was there an incident? Was there a breach? Did you report it? Because if you hide it and you're hiding the information from both the primes that you're working with and the government, that's where your trouble is you're going to run into trouble. Is basically what that's my takeaway to anybody in the audience is if there is a cybersecurity issue, report it and deal with it as best you can. Or on the other hand, you want to prevent it entirely, right? But if you can't, because these incidents are happening, you have to report it and you're monitoring your system. You're reporting as soon as possible within the 72-hour period that everyone is now. All across all government agencies, there's now the 72 hours, you see it. SEC has announced it. There's just uniformly, it seems like the 72-hour window is what everyone's looking at.
This is a good segue, I think, but before we dive into the civil cyber fraud initiative, I want to just get a show of hands. How many have heard of this initiative? Okay. So not too many hands. Okay, maybe like a third or a quarter of the audience. So that's interesting. So Stephanie, why don't you introduce this concept? Is it new? Why should it get the attention of the audience here? And where might we see this take direction?
So let me just back up. So I think we did hear a little about the executive order. So President Biden in May of 2021 introduced this cybersecurity executive order. And it required a review across all the government of all the various components because, and I think it came from the frustration that the government didn't have information to respond to all of the multiple cyber attacks. The SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, Microsoft Exchange. And because they didn't have the information, they presumed that the private sector is hiding this information from us, and we want to know more about cybersecurity incidents. So they did a full-scale review of various agencies. DOJ then announced in October of 2021 what's been called the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative. It was announced by the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, and she made it very clear that what they're intending to do is to go after contractors and hold accountable contractors who put government information at risk. Because they're looking at it from national security, that if our information, national security information is put at risk, and they're looking at 3 different ways that they're put at risk. First, when you make indicate that certain cybersecurity products and services meet certain thresholds. Second, that you're knowingly representing that you have certain cybersecurity protocols or practices and you don't. And third, when you knowingly fail to monitor and report cybersecurity incidents or breaches. And so those are the things that they're going to be looking at. Now, they decided to use the False Claims Act to do this. The False Claims Act has been used, it's been around a long time, since the Civil War. And the False Claims Act allows basically the government to civilly fine a company when they make a false claim to the United States. They submit an invoice for payment. And when you're submitting the invoice for payment pursuant to a government contract, you've made representations in the contract that you're going to meet certain requirements, material requirements of the contract. So that's the false claims. Now, what's different about the False Claims Act than many other laws is it has a unique provision in it. It's the whistleblower provision. And what that means is that it's not just government agents that are investigating and looking for fraud, but they're given a financial incentive to your employees, the insiders at your company, so to look for fraud. And if they find fraud and they report it to the government, and then the government it also determines fraud occurred and there's a recovery, the whistleblower shares in that recovery, 15 to 30% of the recovery. And some of these contracts, but they're looking at it, they look at it, some people, again, lawyers, there's whistleblower lawyers, that whistleblowers go and talk and they file this complaint that's sealed initially, and then the government gets involved. They use the contract, the value of the contract, as the loss. Because the loss under the False Claims Act can be triple damages. So treble damages, triple the amount of the contract, you could argue. And some lawyers have. And I'm not saying that's going to be successful. And I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just telling you basically what the False Claims Act is. And now, having scared you, I will say that I don't think, as a former prosecutor, and having heard the various unclear definitions of the standards, that this can be used unless there has to be, the government has to show a material requirement of the contract that you normally fail to comply with. So what does that mean? What I think the most clear-cut example is that, the one that I already basically highlighted earlier, is when there's a cyber breach and you fail to report it. That, I think, is a very clear-cut thing that the government could actually use the False Claims Act to do. That, so your CISO knows that you had a breach and you didn't report it and you were trying to hide it. That is the exact conduct that the executive order and the DAG mentioned, the Deputy Attorney General mentioned, as a concern for the government. So I think that would be a prime example as to when you should be concerned. If you're a victim of a cyber attack, does that mean you're going to be a false claims action taken against you? No. But you just have to understand that this is something that the government is looking at, and it's not just done in isolation. DOJ is not acting in isolation. Every other week, there's some new initiative that I think people have seen through the government. The FTC is getting involved and concerned because cybersecurity vulnerabilities are not being patched, and that they're getting very concerned about that. The SEC proposed rules regarding, and that was just recently, to require public companies to disclose within 72 hours a breach. And if they don't, they're going to get in trouble with the SEC. And they're going to need cybersecurity expertise on their boards. So this initiative, I think, is just the government uses the whole of government approach. It's a whole of government approach to the cybersecurity issues and breaches and the attacks that we've suffered over the last few years.
Alex?
Yeah, I would just add one quick caveat. There are a couple things with regards to the materiality element, and not to get too legalistic. First of all, I never trust the government to not just blow that out of the water. They don't really necessarily, they're fine arguing materiality. So if you followed False Claims Act cases, you've seen it over the course of the past decade, Trade Agreements Act, right? So you're not manufacturing this pen in Dubuque. You're actually measuring. It's in China, and as a result, we're getting the benefit of the cost. But nonetheless, the Trade Agreements Act is so material to this contract that we're going to sue you under the False Claims Act. That was like literally almost a decade of False Claims Act cases. So I'm a little bit more reticent to say like it's still going to be material. The other side, just to be sensitive to, if you've got naval contracts, the NM cars, and I think this is great because if you want to know what materiality is, and if you have the NM cars cybersecurity requirements in your contract, they actually say in that clause, this is a material.
Annex 16.
Yeah. This is a material requirement of this contract. So ever since the Sea Dragon incident, they've gotten a little uppity. So you need to be sensitive to that. But I think that the False Claims Act has been around for a while. Why DOJ hasn't gone after it until now on the cyber side has always kind of made me kind of, I think it's, I don't know why, but I kind of always thought that it's because they were still trying to get this kumbaya moment with the DOD saying, come on, we don't want to come after you guys. Can you just fix it? Can you just do it, work with us to fix it? And I think at this point they're just like, so no, you're not going to. Okay, cool. Well then we're gonna come at you.
I really do think it's just the issue is they want people to report. They're tired of
do it on their
people,
own. Come on, man.
You're not reporting. You're hiding this from us. And this is what's in all the literature. If you look at the policy statements, the statements that have been made by the DAG and various AGs at the various forums, this is the issue. They just think that the private sector is hiding these cyber attacks, and they want people to be reporting them. And now the new cybersecurity requirements and the NDIA is going to require a 72-hour reporting requirement for infrastructure, which DIB falls in clearly. But the rules won't come out for 2 years, so in the interim, you have DOJ likely going to be looking at these, and who knows how many whistleblowers will come out. I'm not saying, by the way, that they're not going to find materiality or investigate materiality.
Seek it.
Yeah, but I think that you're going to see the most significant deterrence and the civil the false claims actions and the largest settlements, it's going to be in the breach cases where there was no disclosure and information was compromised. Significant sensitive information was compromised.
I also think we need to think about the default mode right now for the DIB, which is because I don't know what CUI is, and there's it's very ambiguous. I have all of this gray area in which to make an internal decision not to report to DIBnet, because who can say whether or not the correct data was involved requiring that reporting window.
It's okay, it's labeled.
Yeah. Well, when we think about the new Senator Peters bill that was passed, that's now the Strengthening Cybersecurity Act, you should all go look at what counts as a major incident. It's data that's very easy to understand whether or not it's that kind of data, and so we could have more situations where information that is being involved in a breach, even just in a drive-by attack that wasn't targeting DIB IP, is still going to trigger the necessity of that reporting, and you're going to have even more opportunities, I guess you could say, for someone to take a look under the hood.
I'd like to switch a little bit to the more cyber side of that. And David, from a prime's perspective, there's you have the obligation to report to the DoD, but you as a prime also have expectations that you have for your supply chain, right? On reporting to you when a breach may involve your data, basically, that's involved in the contract.
So what we've done is, and on that front, we've been very proactive in educating our suppliers that say, look, yes, 7012 is there, you've got a reporting requirement there. We also have it in our terms and conditions under a section that doesn't refer to the DFARS. It just says RTX information. If you've had an incident, report it to us. And I can tell you, our experience has been very collaborative. They are reporting. We've had suppliers that have had issues that have reported both to the DoD and to us. And in most cases, luckily, it wasn't sensitive information. But it's the ones you don't know about. And I think that's what Stephanie was referring to.
Do you get a sense from your supply chain what you think the capabilities are to even detect incidents and report them in a timely manner?
I think part of what we do with some key suppliers, I won't say all suppliers, but we have a process where we go out and evaluate suppliers. And it's when we're vetting a new supplier for new technology, or an existing supplier, or in some cases an incumbent that's been with us a long time. We go out and do assessments, and part of those assessments, there's questions embedded related to cyber. And you can pretty much tell based on how folks answer those questions as to whether they're kind of compliant and they understand the requirements. The ones that, provide questionable answers, we probably go back and have another conversation with them and say, there's follow-up conversations. And it's both supply chain and DT, which is, our new name for IT. But there's DT security that's focused solely on suppliers. And we go out and investigate, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand there's recently the first prosecution under this new initiative. Are there any takeaways that this audience can glean from that prosecution?
So there was the first settlement was announced in it was February. Sorry, no, it was March. Sorry, I was actually thinking about Aerojet when we were talking about that earlier. So in March there was the first settlement announced of comprehensive health solutions, and it was now that case and the False Claims Act investigation there started before the initiative was announced, but it was announced under the initiative, and it started with a whistleblower, and the CHS had to pay $930,000 to resolve the claims. they had not maintained patient data, and it was patient data for Department of State employees and Air Force in Iraq and I believe it was Afghanistan, in a secure network. And that was found to be a violation of the False Claims Act. And they paid a $930,000 fine as a result of that. From all indications that this settlement means is that the DOJ is going to be aggressively looking at these cases, and where appropriate, they are going to be, there's going to be a large fine imposed. And so that's the takeaway from that is just, and that there was also non-cyber related claims also made in that case, but that there are going to, all the statements, I'm sorry, didn't know what that was. And there was quotes made by DOJ when the press release and at the press conference about it, indicating that they were, this was something that they are going to continue looking at, and they're going to be very seriously looking at all of these various cases.
I think it's really interesting to think about that, because when we hear about that case, it looks like, for all intents and purposes, that it began as a False Claims Act investigations unrelated to cyber topics. And then yet yielded, oh, by the way, I noticed that hard drive over there you haven't been securing, here's $930,000 in penalties. I'm really interested to see the inverse of that, where there's a potential False Claims Act investigation or a DOJ investigation. They want to understand what's going on in an organization, and knowing about a potential unreported breach or something related to cyber would actually crack that nut for them and allow a broader investigation. I think that there's really interesting almost interactions between these cyber civil fraud initiatives, and either as the secondary outcome, a target of opportunity for something much larger, or even in the inverse, as a way to begin create an entree into the organization for a bigger investigation.
And that often happens in DOJ. I mean, that sometimes you get like information that, oh, this individual did such and such. But then when you start looking at the company, I'm just speaking from my DOJ background, you find, oh, there's tax fraud here, there's this here, and sometimes there may be, we can't prove, the DOJ can't prove the criminal aspects, so then it gets referred to civil. That maybe there's an administrative angle here that should be pursued. Now, a lot of information can't be shared if it's grand jury information with the civil folks, but there's still DOJ, and that's where I think being on the right side of things and will help the companies if you do have a cyber attack by reporting it. You really do. It's more helpful sometimes. I would tell companies this with export violations. If you find out an employee, mistakenly exports something and it violated the ITAR or the EAR, you're better off self-disclosing before DOJ finds out about it on their own.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. That as a government contractor, and this is where the kind of the rub is, you're under an obligation, right? It's in all your contracts. If you're a government contractor, 52, 203, 213, you have to report, right? There's a mandatory disclosure obligation to the extent that you believe there's been a violation of the False Claims Act. Unfortunately, we're telling you today, and it has been that it has been ongoing for the past decade, that if you are not meeting your cybersecurity obligations and or the requirements of either the FAR clause or the DFARS clause that are in your contracts, guess what? You're not complying with your contract. You might have a reporting obligation. And if you don't have a report, and if you don't report, and they come in, and now there's, we all know this, now that the compliance infrastructure is, it's everywhere. There are all sorts of little gateways into your company that they can ask, and while they're under the hood, they'll say, what's that over there, right? And you have to answer. Well, yeah, we're not really there. Really? Because you have an obligation, you have two obligations, right? You have an obligation to report, and then you have an obligation to meet the requirement. So now you're violating two of your contract clauses. And when we talk about materiality, that becomes a lot more material, right? And what about this one over here, and this one over here? And then the laundry list starts going, and that number, which $900,000, not that bad, not that much, all of a sudden starts going increasing. And I would also say that if you have the word health anywhere in your company name, I would just, I would get all this stuff done pretty quick, because I think that's where they start. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's alphabetical, but H definitely comes before military stuff. So, so if you want to avoid it, the other thing, just real quick, and it's sort of a joke, but I think that like all of us, we all wander around like, hey, does anybody have a template for? I think, and again, we talked about this a little bit. I think DOJ does the same thing. Hey, do you have a template for a False Claims Act case related to cybersecurity? Oh yeah, here you go. And I think that template is now being written or has been written. So I suspect that we're going to start seeing a lot more activity because it's not that hard to write that up. So.
Well, and on top of that, and this was actually just recently, the AG, Attorney General Garland, came out, and this often, I will say, happens. It's because I was in multiple administrations when I was at DOJ. The last administration wasn't hard enough on corporate crime, so that we're going to make that a priority. And we don't think it's sufficient to just find people. We want to put individuals in jail. So I will say that that is a backdrop that you may want to be considering. And when Alex was talking about those questions, what I'm thinking, as a former prosecutor, false statements, oh crap, what are they going to say? How are they answering these questions? Because you're talking to a federal agent typically. That could be a problem, an employee of the federal government. You're making these questions, these disclosures to. That could potentially be a 1001 violation under 18 U.S.C. 1001. So all these things are things that, just we're highlighting for you anyway, it's better to just report if there's a cyber incident.
Now, when we hear that the DoD PMO's office for CMMC is talking about, hey, for SPRS, we're going to start requiring a senior official within the companies to attest to your SPRS score when you upload each year, every year. Like, what other sort of volatile compounds can we add to this mix?
They could call him the defendant.
Thanks.
I know a lawyer.
So not to add on the laws and regulations that folks should keep track of, but we recently had the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act signed into law on March 15th. Now, I think we're a bit of ways out for that to be fully implemented. There's some regulations that have to be fulfilled, but potentially up to 36 months out. But we know that obviously the defense industrial base is a critical infrastructure sector. A lot of what's in there, at least the reporting requirements, are going to look really familiar for folks who are familiar with clauses C through G within section C through G within DFAR 7012. But it is yet another requirement to report out any incidents that you might have. I'm going to kick this over to Ryan. You work with contractors in the DIB of all sizes. When you're typically first engaging with them, what would are they even aware of, because what we hear is DFAR 7012, well, that's 800-171. It's like, well, there's more stuff in there. The reporting requirements, and everybody just says, well, we've done some work, we've got some POAMs, but they're controls focused and not so much focused. When you say, do you have a medium assurance certificate? They're like, what the heck is that? I'd like to hear your experience with just what you think the level of preparedness, of readiness is. We know we're 5 years, 6 years into this. We're seeing laws come from different directions about reporting requirements, but where 5 or 6 years in, what do you think the state of readiness is to even be ready to report? Let's go just DOD under 7012.
Yeah, I'd say that right now we're not in a good spot. Most of the DIB contractors, you've got the surface issue, which is having a medium assurance certificate to even log into DIBnet and upload a report. But let's think about within the context of paragraph C through G, what's actually required from an evidence retention and collection and support of DoD's damage assessment process. I mean, we're talking about collecting images of infected systems, data volumes, the malware involved. We're talking about a real digital forensics capability, which almost doesn't exist in American small business. Forget about the DIB. And so, from that perspective, I think even the ability to put together a picture of what took place in an incident is lacking. And so as a result of that, most of the organizations, even if they could meet the bare minimum of simply being able to log into a portal, when they go to actually put forth the information that's needed or it needs to be retained, they wouldn't have much, if anything at all. So there's some real deficiencies there. And then when we look at layering over top of that the new bill, at the time you submit the report, you're supposed to disclose the protections that were in place at the time of the assessment. So talk about adding even more risk and liability here. Now if I'm going to say, oh, 800-171 was in place, or all these other things were in place, and then it turns out that some of those weren't, I mean, that's yet another data point that can be introduced in the course of this process as another materially false claim.
So David, going back from not to pick on the primes, but you're here, so you volunteered. When you see things like this, does it, obviously we've got the 7012 requirements, but when you see this new bill coming out and the additional requirements, does that cause you to have another look at your requirements that you push down to your subs?
It certainly does. I mean, I think both from a T's and C's perspective, and then if you look at what was presented earlier today in CMMC, okay, how much of that critical infrastructure now falls under level 1, right? So, and there may be a discrepancy as to whether it's in level 1 or level 2, So, the challenge that we have and the feedback that we have back from medium to small businesses, I couldn't afford your T's and C's before. And now you're requiring, they look at us as like we're the ones flowing it. It's like, well, some of them are ours, some of them aren't. And so it's going to get more expensive. And it's going to be embedded cost, and it's going to be hard to determine, is it really something that DoD should be paying for, as opposed to it flowing up to the primes and then us being challenged on our costs. Because that happens a lot, where we're kind of, I won't say we're the poor guys stuck in the middle, but it does happen, where you have to get something executed. We don't have time to go back to the DoD every time and argue about costs. So sometimes we just have to move forward and do things.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think we're going to leave hopefully about 10 minutes of questions. So we've got, I'd say, like 7 more minutes or so. I'd like to talk about what are some key takeaways we want to leave people with. I think the elephant in the room here is, with this new initiative, be careful what you represent, right? But what if somebody is hearing this and having an honest conversation with themselves about where they really are? Stephanie, I'll start with you. What should they do today if maybe as they re-examine their state of compliance, they realize maybe there's a bit of a delta in between what they've said and where they really are?
So I think from a company perspective, training your folks on the cybersecurity standards and how we're going to meet those cybersecurity standards would be a very important thing. Because one of the things that DOJ looks at is like, okay, what is your compliance program? What is, and when you're talking about cybersecurity, I think it's no different. How are you seeking to comply with the standards? And so, how have you put it together? Do you have a cybersecurity incident plan that's like not on the network, so when you get a ransomware attack, you can access it? I mean, we were talking about that during our discussion. It's amazing to me. It's like, well, everything's encrypted. I can't access a company. So I can't access anything. I don't even know what contracts I have or what my requirements are. Well, you have to have something that's not on the network. And obviously you want to make sure they have standalones that are backups that have that data as well. That are not connected to your network. But being able to document for the government what steps you took, how you were seeking to comply. And we were talking about all these self-assessments, but that is really going to be critical when it comes time to, if there is a jury trial on the False Claims Act. Can you demonstrate how you try to, what you did and how you try to, because the standards are not as clear-cut as a prosecutor, I would say, would want, or a lawyer would want, but to show that you were taking reasonable steps to get there. So there was no material misrepresentation because you were doing it. So that's the takeaway. But understand that DOJ is, and I think again, the government is looking at this, because of all the cybersecurity attacks very seriously and seeing how they can ensure that they have information when the cyber attacks occur. And I realized I don't think I said my firm's name when I announced myself earlier. So I'm at Hinckley Allen, and I have a table outside if you have any questions after we're done.
Careful what you wish for. David?
So I think the messaging back to particularly the businesses is fill out your annual reps and certs accurately. And if you have questions, ask us. We're here to help. I mean, we're here to facilitate, the proper reporting, and we need all of these businesses to support our business, to support the government and the warfighter. So don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, I think for me, I think what the biggest takeaway is, and I'm trying to put it all into context. I really do believe you need to maybe start with your incident response plan. And the reason I say that is because as you start with your incident response plan, you can branch out to find out those issues that you have a problem with. You figure out who do you have to report to, when do you have to report, why do you have to report, what have you already reported, what have you already stated, what have you already determined, what have you already certified, and that's to include cybersecurity, et cetera. I've never said that out loud, but as we were talking about it today, I think that's really where you want to start, right? Everybody should have one. It's in 800-171, it isn't, but if you look at the Appendix D and E, it is, because they assume you already have one. So I would start there. And then with the critical infrastructure side of things, that's coming down the pike for a long time. A lot of solutions for a lot of industries, especially medium-sized DIB members, has been to, we'll use an enclave. We'll just put our defense CUI or CTI or CDI or whatever the nom de guerre is for the time being, into a box, and that's good. But now, because of critical infrastructure, you have 16 different industry sectors, one of which is DIB, the rest are rather wide-ranging, that are going to have this sort of new notification requirement coming up within the next 2 years. So, okay, cool, so that's not going to work anymore. Now we have a little bit broader reach. So if you've kind of said, thank God we don't do defense work, well, congratulations, we're writing on this, it'll be out tomorrow, you've been drafted now. So, so to me, I think that's actually a really good place. That's pragmatic. Look at your incident response plan, look at it holistically, and kind of broaden out to say, okay, who do we have to report to? Like Stephanie was saying, who do we have to report to? Why do we have to report to them? What contracts do we have? Who in those contracts do we have to report to, et cetera, et cetera? Because your incident response plan isn't 16 pages. If you're doing it right, it's going to be, more than 16 pages. So that's where I would start.
As measured in 16 pages.
Pages, right, yeah. I use the hexa, yeah.
Well, to give you some partial credit, identifying who your internal stakeholders for reporting are and your external authorities is in CMMC.
Right.
And you are assessed against that. And so, even that small part of an incident response strategy is very much in the bounds of what we're talking about today. I think that if there's one piece of information that the DIB needs to understand, it's that rapid reporting creates numerous protections for you the moment you decide to do the right thing. And the DC3 teams who respond to these reports, they don't necessarily do follow-ups on every single reported incident. They're looking for novel incidents. They're looking for something they haven't seen before. Really, the goal of that entire program is to build a better sensor network for the DoD so that they understand when these trends are starting to emerge. So when the same malware strains affect more of the DIB, they can respond, things like that. We're going to continue to have really brittle, fragile, uninformed models for security if we don't create better inputs for the DoD. I'm not saying that we have to completely try and give them everything, but what I am saying is that you're doing what is required of you when you submit these incident reports, and it's okay if you don't have all the information when you submit the report. It's a 90-day window for follow-ups. You can get better information later. You can call more people in to be involved. Just file the darn report and get yourself out of a liable situation.
Yeah, don't overstate or understate on that one. That's the big thing. Everybody's like, I got to find it all out. No, don't.
It's okay
do
to say I don't
Yeah.
know what's going on right now. Yeah.
That's great.
So we'll do some questions. One of the things, I'll start with the first question, okay? And I'm looking at you, Dave. I don't mean to single you out. But you can avoid non-compliance if you don't have to worry about compliance. right? So how does Raytheon work with its supply chain to determine whether the clause should be flowed down at all, or whether the sub is actually in possession of CUI or needs to be in possession of CUI, so that it has to worry about compliance? Because I think a large, we heard it earlier, and we see this with our clients, a large group of them are just treating everything as CUI, and therefore all of a sudden they find themselves in this pool of compliance where they don't necessarily have to be.
So great question. What I will tell you is that there's a couple different things that Raytheon does. One is, we go through our contracts and determine which flow downs apply. We send them out. We send them out with language that says, if you're doing this, this, and this applies. If it doesn't, then you have to self-delete those clauses, so to speak. We also additionally have spent a lot of time training our internal folks on be aware of what you're sending to who, when, and where. And in part of that, we've given them kind of a matrix that says, is this CUI, is it not? When we've got markings on our documents. I will get on my soapbox a little, is that, the DOD isn't doing their job either with telling us. I mean, I can give you an example of a recent solicitation we got from a major agency. They took the solicitation and then every single attachment and slapped the cover page on it and said, this whole thing's CUI. So, okay, so then that means the whole program is CUI? It's like, come on, that's not correct. So, unfortunately, we've had to fill the gaps with what DOD hasn't done. And I would say the other primes are probably in the same position of, be very mindful of what you're sending to who and know when it's applicable and when it's not. And, suppliers are pretty good about reaching back and saying, hey, I don't think this applies to me. And then we have a discussion. So it's not foolproof, but we do the best we can.
All right, I think we have a question from the virtual audience.
A few of them, actually. So going to be quick, rapid-fire virtual questions. The first is, how many companies have been charged under the FCA for violating 7012?
I think the only notable case we know about is Aerojet Rocketdyne,
Exactly.
where internal folks asked their IT teams to sign off on security attestations, and they said, heck no, and then became the whistleblower. What I'm interested to find out is these are sealed complaints.
Yeah.
So how many are under the waterline right now?
And so, yeah, exactly. And that's how all the False Claims Act cases begin. They're sealed, and there's an attorney, basically a whistleblower attorney, that drafts them up. And then they're submitted to DOJ, and then they decide whether to, what happens as a result of that. And with Aerojet, the other thing, in addition to the 7012 issue, there was also a breach where a foreign government got information, and so that's where I think and that was filed in 2015, and it's still going on today. The trial is scheduled, I think, in July of this year. And the damages that are being sought, and again, remember the 15 to 30% I mentioned earlier, $19 billion.
That's a good early retirement strategy.
Yeah.
For that.
Now,
For the IT
that's
director,
never.
right.
I don't think that's ever going to be the amount, and the judge actually had concerns with it because it was 3 times, and it was like 18 various contracts. And et cetera, but that's what they would want, 3 times. And the issue is then, okay, did the government get the value, and what value did they get? They did get goods under the contract or whatever they got. It wasn't like they got nothing, so the loss is not the entire amount of the contract. And that was what the argument is by many of these whistleblowers, are called relators, in these cases. But I can't give you a number because almost all of them are sealed. And so, but why I think going back to the question we were talking about, if you don't report, your employees are going to know you didn't report, right, as a company. So you have potential insiders and whistleblowers in your company. So, but if you report, then there's nothing they have to report to the government.
Well, and I'd also add on that note too, you also need to educate your employees on what you're doing, right? And I think this is something we saw a lot with during COVID and vaccination. You need to educate your employees on what you're doing and why. Because if you don't educate them, then all you've done is, if you tell them, hey, we have these obligations, you've created you've seeded the company with possible relators. And you don't want to do that because the thing we don't talk about, and Stephanie brought it up kind of tangentially, is there is a cottage industry. There are lawyers out there that are literally writing these drafts of these complaints, and they're going out to all of your employees saying, you want to be a relator? You want to be a relator? You want to be a relator? Because they also get it. They get a third of that third. So that's, again, another piece of it. So, but you need to educate your employees on what it is you're doing. So yes, report, but also educate your employees that when we see stuff, we say stuff.
So two-part question for the next one. And this is the last one, sorry. Does the 72-hour reporting requirement apply to only the government agency or members of the DIB or all organizations? There have been some conflicting interpretations of that. And then the second part of the question is, for primes, how are you flowing down requirements to your subcontractors? Is there documentation that you're passing down for them to then pass down that kind of flow chart?
So I think we should, there's multiple 72-hour reporting requirements now, which I'm sure doesn't help. But we've got DFAR's 7012 requirements within the DIB. But then we have the new bill, which will go into effect in 2 years, and that applies to any recipient of federal money or grants. Grants are now part of this as well.
Yep.
So that's a much bigger pool of organizations who need to think about this as well. It also sort of closes some of the gaps in what we see in like non-traditional contracting, OTAs, SIBRs, things like that, which might not have normally been as in focus for 7012 and things like that. I know we've seen people in OTA space who try to get around 7012. This would make that very hard. So I think there's multiple. And there are different
requirements for different agencies. If you're doing a contract with GSA, not GSA schedule, but GSA proper, they're going to have a different a number. At one point it was 24 hours. And at one point I remember seeing some contract requirements. And again, don't forget, every contract can be different because of the H clauses, right? So in the H clauses, that's creative writing for contracting officers. And as a result, they can make that even more restrictive. So you have to be very sensitive to all of that. You have to know what's in your contract. Shocker. That's a takeaway.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our panelists.